Rich businessman shames his waitress, but days later, he's shocked by her secret life. Ethan Cross sat at his usual corner table in the Silver Ridge Bistro, a restaurant that had become a staple for the city's elite. The polished mahogany tables gleamed under the dim, golden light of the chandeliers, and the quiet hum of classical music added an air of sophistication to the room. Ethan preferred this table for its view of the entire dining area, a vantage point from which he often assessed people. Not that he cared much about them, but old habits of power and control were hard to break. He barely glanced at the menu before placing it down. He wasn't here for the food. For Ethan, the restaurant was less about fine dining and more about reminding himself and others of his place in the social hierarchy. His company was worth billions, a conglomerate spanning industries and continents. Deals were struck, lives were changed, and fortunes were made by the decisions he casually signed off on from the comfort of his glass-walled office. As Ethan scrolled through his phone, skimming emails from his assistant about the details of an impending merger, a shadow passed across the table. "Good evening, sir. Can I take your order?" He looked up, not bothering to mask his irritation at being interrupted. The waitress standing before him was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with chestnut hair tied into a simple ponytail. She wore the restaurant's uniform, a crisp white blouse tucked into a black pencil skirt, but there was something about her posture that was different, confident, self-assured. It annoyed him for reasons he couldn't immediately name. Ethan sighed, setting his phone down with exaggerated reluctance. "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare, and don't skimp on the wine. Something from the reserve list. I trust you can handle that." Her pen moved across the notepad with practiced ease. "Certainly, sir. Would you like any sides with that?" "Surprise me," he replied curtly, already returning to his phone. The waitress lingered a moment longer than he expected, her eyes lingering on him. "I'll make sure everything's perfect," she said, her tone measured. There was no servile sweetness, none of the usual eagerness to please that he expected. She walked away with the same quiet confidence she'd approached with, and for a moment, Ethan found himself irritated by her lack of deference. The evening progressed much as Ethan had expected. The food arrived promptly, cooked to perfection, and the wine was precisely what he had in mind. The waitress returned periodically, her tone polite but never overly warm, always professional. He noticed her efficiency, the way she managed her tables with ease, her movements precise but never rushed. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. People in her position were supposed to fade into the background, but something about her presence was undeniable. When she returned with the check, Ethan glanced up at her. "You're very good at your job," he said, the words carrying more edge than compliment. "You must have been doing this a long time." "Thank you," she replied evenly, not rising to the bait. "I've been here for a few years. And is this what you see yourself doing forever?" Carrying plates and pouring wine. His tone was casual, but the insult was unmistakable. For the first time, her composure faltered slightly, but only for a fraction of a second. She met his gaze directly, her voice calm but firm. "Everyone has their path, sir. Some paths are more visible than others." Ethan smirked, leaning back in his chair, spoken like someone trying to make peace with mediocrity. Samantha's grip on the tray tightened, but her expression remained composed. "Enjoy your evening, sir," she said before walking away. Ethan watched a retreating figure, a faint smirk on his face. For him, the interaction was already forgotten, another moment in a long string of insignificant encounters that filled his day. But for Samantha, the sting of his words lingered as she stepped into the kitchen. The hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, and the sharp hiss of steam from the coffee machine faded into the background. She exhaled slowly, letting the moment pass. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to belittle her, and it wouldn't be the last. Samantha had learned long ago not to let such moments define her. Samantha moved through the rest of her shift with her usual efficiency, her mind drifting back to the encounter with Ethan only briefly. She had faced worse, after all. The assumption that her role defined her worth wasn't new, especially for men like him, wealthy, arrogant, accustomed to a world that bent to their will. She had learned to brush off their words, focusing instead on what truly mattered. At the end of the night, when the restaurant emptied out and the staff began clearing the last of the tables, Samantha stayed behind to finish her closing duties. The kitchen had gone quiet, and the dining room was dimly lit, save for the soft glow of a chandelier that flickered faintly above the hostess stand. She slipped into the back office, pulling out a worn leather bag from under a desk. From it, she retrieved a thick folder, its edges slightly frayed, filled with documents and handwritten notes. On the cover was a logo, a phoenix rising from flames, and the words, HopeWorks Foundation. Her lips curled into a small, satisfied smile as she leafed through the papers. This was her world, the one Ethan Cross couldn't see. HopeWorks was her nonprofit, an organization she had founded years ago to support young artists and provide resources to individuals struggling to pursue their dreams. Samantha poured every ounce of her spare time and much of her earnings into its operations. It was her passion, her purpose. Tonight's shift was already forgotten as she reviewed the day's progress. One of her mints, a promising painter named Jordan, had just landed a gallery exhibition. Another, a musician, had been offered a scholarship to a prestigious conservatory. Samantha felt a familiar sense of pride welling up inside her. This was why she worked as hard as she did, why she tolerated the dismissive remarks of men like Ethan. They saw a waitress. She knew she was so much more. Meanwhile, Ethan left the restaurant and stepped into the back seat of his sleek black car. The city's lights blurred past the tinted windows as his driver navigated the busy streets. Ethan leaned back, scrolling through his phone, scanning the latest updates from his legal team and his board of directors. The upcoming merger with a competitor, Axis Enterprises, had consumed most of his energy over the past few months. It was poised to be the crowning achievement of his career, the deal that would cement his legacy. But tonight, his mind drifted, uncharacteristically unfocused. He found himself replaying the interaction with Samantha. Her words, though polite, carried an undertone he couldn't quite place. It was as if she had seen through him in a way most people didn't dare to. "Everything all right, sir?" his driver asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Ethan shook his head, dismissing the thought. "Fine. Just thinking." When the car pulled into the driveway of his penthouse, Ethan stepped out and made his way to the elevator. The expansive apartment felt colder than usual as he entered, the glass walls offering a sweeping view of the city. He poured himself a drink and sat on the edge of the sofa, the dim glow of his phone screen reflecting in his eyes. For a man who thrived on power and control, Ethan felt something unfamiliar that night, disquiet. The next day, Samantha's life carried on as usual. She woke before dawn, slipping into a pair of worn running shoes and heading to the park for her morning jog. The crisp air bit at her cheeks, and the rhythm of her footsteps against the pavement steadied her thoughts. Afterward, she spent an hour reviewing grant applications for HopeWorks, carefully choosing which projects to fund. These were the moments she cherished most, knowing her efforts could help someone take the next step toward their dreams. By mid-afternoon, she was back at the restaurant, tying her apron as the lunch rush began. Her coworkers greeted her warmly. Samantha was well-liked, respected not just for her work ethic but for the quiet kindness she extended to everyone around her. It wasn't long before Ethan appeared again, this time with a business associate in tow. Samantha spotted him immediately, his sharp suit and commanding presence impossible to miss. She wasn't surprised. Men like him frequented places like this. But when he glanced in her direction, she caught a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, recognition. "Table for two," Ethan said to the hostess, his tone clipped. Samantha was assigned to their table again, a coincidence she wouldn't have chosen but one she faced with practiced calm. She approached with the same professionalism as always, greeting them and taking their orders without lingering. But this time, Ethan didn't ignore her. As she set their drinks down, he leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You work a lot, don't you?" he asked casually, his tone less condescending than before. Samantha straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "As much as I need to," she replied evenly. Ethan smirked, tilting his head. "And how much is that?" Her answer was measured. Enough to keep moving forward. Ethan's associate laughed, oblivious to the weight of their exchange. Samantha offered a polite smile and stepped away, her composure intact, but her thoughts racing. She had faced condescension before, but this was different. His words felt probing, as if he were trying to understand something he didn't yet have the language for. As the meal progressed, Ethan found himself distracted. His associate rambled on about quarterly projections, but Ethan's attention drifted back to Samantha. Her poise, her confidence, there was something about her he couldn't ignore. When she returned with a check, Ethan watched her carefully. "You're an interesting one," he said, almost to himself. "Thank you," Samantha replied simply, collecting the payment before walking away. For the second time, she left him unsettled. Ethan wasn't used to feeling this way, and he didn't like it. But deep down, he knew he wasn't ready to let it go. Ethan's curiosity began to grow into something more persistent. It wasn't just her confidence that lingered in his mind, but the subtle way she seemed unaffected by him. People rarely stood their ground with Ethan Cross, and yet this waitress, Samantha, managed to do so without ever raising her voice or breaking her calm demeanor. It gnawed at him in ways he couldn't explain. That evening, after another long day of meetings and negotiations, Ethan found himself at home, staring at his laptop. His assistant had sent over the profiles of the speakers for an upcoming charity gala his company was invited to sponsor. It was a routine event, something he typically handed off to his PR team to handle. But tonight, his attention wandered to the files. As he scanned through the names, his eyes froze on one, Samantha Blake, founder of HopeWorks Foundation. A photo accompanied the name, a professional headshot of Samantha, her hair styled neatly, her expression poised and composed. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Founder, he muttered aloud, narrowing his eyes at the screen. He clicked on her profile and began reading. Samantha Blake was the founder and executive director of HopeWorks, a nonprofit organization that had garnered significant attention in the city for its work supporting artists, students, and struggling professionals. The foundation provided grants, mentorship programs, and resources to individuals from underprivileged backgrounds. Ethan read through the list of accolades, local awards, features in philanthropic magazines, partnerships with prominent community organizations. The more he read, the harder it became to reconcile the polished, accomplished figure on his screen with the waitress who had served him filet mignon the night before. His curiosity deepened into something sharper, an unrelenting need to understand. He pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Jessica," he said, not bothering with a greeting. "Find out everything you can about HopeWorks Foundation and its founder, Samantha Blake. I want a full report by tomorrow." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Of course, Mr. Cross," Jessica replied, her tone efficient. "Anything specific you're looking for?" "Everything," he said curtly before hanging up. The next day, Ethan arrived at his office early, restless. The file Jessica compiled was waiting on his desk, neatly organized and far more thorough than he'd expected. He flipped through it quickly, taking in every detail. Samantha Blake's story began to unfold before him. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood on the city's outskirts, the daughter of a music teacher and a seamstress. Her father's passion for the arts had inspired her, and by her early 20s, Samantha had begun teaching art classes in her community. But tragedy struck when her parents passed away in a car accident, leaving her to fend for herself. What stood out most to Ethan was how Samantha had channeled her grief into something greater. Using what little savings she had in donations from friends and local businesses, she founded HopeWorks at just 24 years old. The nonprofit had grown steadily over the years, gaining recognition for its impact. Ethan lingered on a page that detailed one of the foundation's flagship programs, the Artist's Ladder, a mentorship initiative that paired young creatives with industry professionals. The testimonials from participants spoke volumes about Samantha's leadership and vision. But what puzzled Ethan was why someone with her credentials and accomplishments would be working as a waitress. The report didn't provide any answers to that question, leaving him more intrigued and unsettled than ever. Later that evening, Ethan returned to the Silver Ridge Bistro. He wasn't entirely sure why he was there. He told himself it was to satisfy his curiosity, to confirm whether Samantha was truly the same woman from the profile, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. When Samantha approached his table, her expression was calm as always, though he noticed a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Back again, Mr. Cross?" she asked, her tone polite but with a hint of dry humor. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "It seems this place grows on you," he replied, his voice measured. Samantha nodded, waiting patiently for his order. "I'll have the special," he said, then added, "and a moment of your time, if you don't mind." Samantha hesitated briefly before replying, "I'm afraid I can only offer a moment. It's a busy night." Ethan smirked. "Fair enough. I'll keep it brief." As she jotted down his order and prepared to leave, Ethan stopped her with a question that hung heavy in the air. "Why do you work here, Samantha?" Her hand froze mid-motion, and for the first time, composure wavered slightly. She looked up, her expression guarded. "Because it pays the bills," she said simply. "Is that all?" Ethan pressed, his tone soft but probing. Samantha's eyes narrowed slightly, her patience clearly wearing thin. "If you're trying to figure me out, Mr. Cross, you'll need more than a few questions to do it." Ethan couldn't help but smile. There it was again, that quiet defiance that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. "Perhaps I will," he said lightly, letting the moment pass. Samantha left the table, her back straight and her steps deliberate. Ethan watched her go, his curiosity burning brighter than ever. The following week, Ethan found himself seated at a table in the grand ballroom of the city's cultural center. The charity gala was in full swing, the room buzzing with conversation and the clinking of glasses. Ethan's company had contributed significantly to the event, ensuring his presence was both expected and necessary. When Samantha took the stage, the room fell silent. She stood confidently at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. Dressed in a sleek black gown, she seemed worlds away from the waitress Ethan had met. "Good evening, everyone," Samantha began, her voice steady and warm. "It's an honor to stand here tonight and share the work we do at HopeWorks Foundation. This organization began as a small dream, a way to give back to a community that gave so much to me." As she spoke, Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. She recounted stories of the foundation's impact, weaving humor and emotion into her speech with ease. The audience hung on her every word. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar: admiration. When the speech concluded, the room erupted into applause. Samantha stepped down from the stage, greeted by a wave of attendees eager to meet her. Ethan watched from a distance, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and realizations. He had come here seeking answers, but instead, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew, not just about Samantha, but about himself. As the applause faded and the crowd dispersed into smaller groups, Ethan made his way toward the corner of the ballroom where Samantha was engaged in a lively conversation with several attendees. She smiled warmly, her laughter genuine, as she responded to their questions about her foundation. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to this, approaching someone without the upper hand. Finally, he stepped forward, his presence commanding as always. The group noticed him immediately, their chatter pausing as they shifted to make way. Samantha turned, her expression flickering with a mix of recognition and curiosity. "Mr. Cross," she greeted, her voice polite but measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Ethan offered a small smile, unsure of how to begin. "I couldn't miss an event like this. Your foundation's work is impressive." Samantha studied him, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "Thank you. I'm glad you think so." "I do," he said, his tone sincere. "I'd like to know more about it, about you." Her brow lifted slightly, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gestured toward a quieter part of the ballroom. "Why don't we step aside?" Ethan followed her to a small alcove near the windows. The city's skyline stretched out behind them, a dazzling display of lights against the night sky. Samantha folded her hands in front of her, her expression calm but unreadable. "What would you like to know?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. He had prepared countless pitches, arguments, and negotiations in his life, but this felt different. He wasn't here to convince or win. He was here to understand. "I read about you," he admitted. "About your foundation, your background. You've built something extraordinary. But I can't help wondering, why the restaurant? Why work as a waitress when you've achieved so much?" Samantha's gaze didn't waver. "Because sometimes, the best way to stay grounded is to remember where you came from," she said simply. "HopeWorks was born out of my experiences. I know what it feels like to be underestimated, to struggle, to feel invisible. Working at the restaurant keeps me connected to the people I'm trying to help." Ethan leaned against the wall, her words hitting harder than he expected. "That's admirable," he said, his voice quieter now. "But surely you don't need to put yourself through that. You could." "Do what?" she interrupted gently. "Sit in an office and sign checks? Don't misunderstand me, Mr. Cross. I don't work there because I have to. I work there because I choose to. It reminds me that worth isn't measured by status or wealth." Her words landed like a quiet rebuke, but there was no malice in her tone. If anything, she seemed to pity him. For a man like Ethan, who had spent his life chasing power and prestige, her perspective was almost incomprehensible. "Doesn't it bother you, though?" he pressed. "Being looked down on by people who don't know who you are? People like me?" Samantha smiled faintly, a touch of humor in her expression. "Oh, it bothered me at first," she admitted. "But I realized something important. Their judgment says more about them than it does about me." Ethan didn't respond right away. He stared out at the city lights, her words stirring something deep within him. For the first time in years, he felt small. not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that reminded him of how much he had forgotten. You know, he said after a long pause, I built my company from nothing. Worked my way up, clawed for every inch of success. And yet, listening to you, I can't help but wonder if I lost something along the way. Samantha regarded him thoughtfully. It's never too late to find it, she said softly. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what that meant for him yet. He felt unmoored, as if the foundation of his carefully constructed life had begun to crack. Before he could say more, another attendee approached, interrupting their conversation. Samantha excused herself with a polite nod, leaving Ethan standing alone by the window. He watched her move through the crowd, her presence as commanding as any CEO he had ever met. And yet, it wasn't power she radiated, it was purpose. The next morning, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the stack of documents on his desk. The merger with Axis Enterprises loomed over him like a shadow, its promises of expansion and profit now feeling hollow. For years, Ethan had measured success by the numbers in his bank account and the size of his company. But Samantha's words lingered in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about value and impact. He flipped through the file on HopeWorks again, pausing on the section about their mentorship programs. The testimonials from participants struck a chord he hadn't expected. One young woman wrote about how the foundation had helped her attend college, a dream she'd thought was impossible. Another described how the mentorship program had given him the confidence to pursue a career in photography. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. Samantha's approach was so different from his own. She wasn't building an empire, she was building lives. And while he had dismissed her at first as just a waitress, he now saw that she was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. A week later, Ethan returned to the Silver Ridge Bistro. This time, he didn't arrive with arrogance or condescension. He entered quietly, scanning the room until he spotted Samantha clearing a table near the back. She noticed him almost immediately, her expression unreadable as he approached. Mr. Cross, she said, setting down the tray she was holding. What brings you here this time? Ethan hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice earnest, for how I treated you before. I was wrong. Samantha raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. And what brought about this change of heart? You did, he admitted. You reminded me that success isn't just about what you have, it's about what you do with it. I've spent so long chasing the former, I think I forgot about the latter. Samantha studied him for a moment, her expression softening. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, she said. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it? Ethan smiled faintly, a spark of determination in his eyes. I was hoping you could help me figure that out. For the first time, Samantha's smile reached her eyes. Maybe, she said, but only if you're willing to do the work. I am, he said firmly. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan meant it. Over the following weeks, Ethan began to transform in ways that surprised even himself. His days, once dominated by cold business deals and power plays, now included meetings with Samantha and her team at HopeWorks. At first, he approached it like another business endeavor, an opportunity to invest in something meaningful. But the more time he spent with Samantha and the people her foundation served, the more his perspective began to shift. One afternoon, Samantha invited Ethan to visit the HopeWorks Community Center. The building was modest, tucked away in a quieter part of the city, but it buzzed with energy and life. The walls were lined with artwork from local students, and the faint sound of music drifted from one of the classrooms. Ethan followed Samantha as she led him through the space, explaining the various programs they offered. This is our art room, she said, gesturing to a brightly lit space where a group of children sat at long tables painting. Most of these kids come from neighborhoods where art programs have been cut entirely. This is their chance to express themselves. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on a young boy hunched over his canvas, his brow furrowed in concentration. Do you do this every day? He asked. Samantha smiled. Not every day, but as often as I can. It's the best part of my work, seeing their creativity come to life. They continued down the hall to another room, where a teenager strummed a guitar while an older man offered gentle guidance. And here, Samantha said, is our music mentorship program. That's Jordan. He started here 2 years ago, and now he's preparing for a scholarship audition. Ethan watched as the boy's face lit up when he nailed a particularly tricky chord. For a moment, he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or admiration. He glanced at Samantha, who was watching Jordan with the same expression. "You've built something incredible here," he said quietly. Samantha turned to him, her smile soft. "It's not about what I've built, Ethan. It's about the people who walk through those doors. This is their space, their opportunity. I just try to give them the tools to succeed." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, taking it all in. For years, he had measured success by the size of his company and the number of deals he closed. But here, success was something entirely different, something far more meaningful. As the weeks went on, Ethan began to take steps to incorporate what he'd learned into his own life. He started small, making changes within his company to prioritize ethical practices and community engagement. He reached out to local organizations, offering resources and partnerships to support underserved communities. But the biggest change was within himself. For the first time, Ethan began to see people, not as assets or obstacles, but as individuals with their own stories, struggles, and dreams. He no longer viewed his wealth and power as a shield to separate himself from others, but as tools to make a difference. Samantha, true to her word, held him accountable. She challenged him to go beyond surface-level gestures and commit to meaningful, lasting change. It wasn't easy. Ethan had spent years cultivating habits that prioritized profit over people, but Samantha's unwavering belief in the power of purpose inspired him to keep going. One evening, as they sat in the HopeWorks office reviewing grant applications, Ethan turned to Samantha. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "You've already achieved so much. Why keep pushing?" Samantha leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "Because I've seen what happens when people give up," she said. "My parents were the kindest, most generous people I've ever known, but they struggled. They gave everything they had to help others. But when they were gone, there was no one left to carry the torch. I promised myself I wouldn't let their legacy fade." Ethan nodded, her words resonating deeply. "And now you've built a legacy of your own." She smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "Maybe. But legacies aren't about buildings or programs. They're about the lives you touch. If I can help even one person believe in themselves, then it's worth it." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long, he had chased a legacy of wealth and power, but Samantha's words made him realize how hollow that pursuit had been. She had created something far more enduring, something that truly mattered. The culmination of their efforts came months later, at a HopeWorks gala organized to celebrate the foundation's 10-year anniversary. Ethan had played a significant role in sponsoring the event, and Samantha had insisted he take part in the evening's program. As the ballroom filled with guests, many of them young artists and professionals whose lives had been transformed by HopeWorks, Ethan found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: pride. Not the fleeting satisfaction of closing a deal, but the deep, enduring pride of knowing he had contributed to something meaningful. When it was his turn to speak, Ethan stepped onto the stage, the weight of the moment settling over him. He glanced at Samantha, who stood near the edge of the stage, her expression calm and encouraging. "I spent most of my life chasing success," Ethan began, his voice steady. "I thought success was about numbers, about how much you could earn, how many deals you could close. But over the past year, I've learned something that has completely changed the way I see the world." He paused, scanning the room. "True success isn't about what you take. It's about what you give. And it's about the people you lift up along the way. Samantha, Blake, and HopeWorks have taught me that. They've shown me what it means to truly make a difference." The audience erupted into applause, and Ethan stepped back, his chest tight with emotion. Samantha joined him on stage, her smile radiant as she took the microphone. "HopeWorks was built on the idea that every person has potential," she said. "Tonight, we're celebrating not just the foundation, but the people who make it what it is. People like all of you. And people like Ethan, who've chosen to use their resources to create something bigger than themselves." As the applause filled the room again, Ethan and Samantha exchanged a glance. It was a moment of mutual respect and understanding, a testament to the journey they had both taken to get there. For Ethan, the gala wasn't the end of his transformation, it was just the beginning. And for Samantha, it was a reminder that even the most unlikely people could surprise you. As the gala wound down and the attendees began to filter out, Ethan found himself standing by one of the tall windows overlooking the city. The night sky was clear, the skyline glittering in a way that seemed almost hopeful. For years, this view had symbolized his dominance, a reminder of how far he'd come. Tonight, it felt different, a backdrop to something far greater than himself. Samantha approached quietly, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. She handed one to him without a word, then leaned against the window frame, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You did well up there," she said after a moment, breaking the silence. Ethan chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "You make it sound like I was taking a test." "In a way, you were," she replied, her tone light but laced with meaning. "It's not easy to stand up and admit you've changed. A lot of people never get there." Ethan looked at her, her calm confidence as steady as ever. "I had a good teacher," he said. "You have a way of making people see what really matters." Samantha smiled faintly, but she didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned back to the view, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked finally. "Not just for you, but for the legacy you're building now." Ethan considered her question. The version of himself from a year ago would have answered without hesitation. Another deal, another expansion, another milestone to conquer. But now the answer didn't come as easily. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time, I'm okay with not knowing. That's new for me." Samantha nodded, her smile widening just slightly. "That's growth." They stood in silence for a while, watching as the city moved on without them, its rhythm unbroken. For Ethan, the moment felt like an exhale, a release from years of pressure and expectations he had placed on himself. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it without the need for control. A few weeks after the gala, Ethan's transformation continued to ripple outward. The changes within his company began to take root, shifting the focus toward ethical practices and community impact. Departments that had once operated in silos were now collaborating to create programs that prioritized more than just profit margins. One such program, inspired by his work with Samantha, involved a partnership with HopeWorks. The initiative provided mentorship opportunities for young professionals in underserved communities, giving them access to resources and networks they might not have otherwise. At the launch event for the program, Ethan found himself once again standing beside Samantha. She introduced him to some of the participants, her passion for the work as vibrant as ever. "Do you remember when you asked me why I work at the restaurant?" Samantha asked him as they watched a young woman present her photography portfolio to a group of mentors. Ethan nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Hard to forget. I work there because it reminds me of what's important," she said. "But I think you found your own way to remember now." He looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. "Maybe I have," he said softly, "but I still have a lot to learn." Samantha glanced at him, her expression warm. "That's the point, Ethan. Growth isn't about reaching a destination, it's about the journey." Ethan's journey continued, marked by small but meaningful shifts in his perspective and actions. He began volunteering his time at HopeWorks, mentoring young entrepreneurs and sharing his experiences in a way that felt honest and vulnerable. It wasn't easy for him. Being open was a skill he was still learning, but it was rewarding in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, as he prepared to leave the community center, a young man approached him. He was one of the participants in the mentorship program, a college student who had recently started his own business. "Mr. Cross," the young man said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you've shared with us, it's changed the way I see things." Ethan smiled, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and humility. "You're the one doing the work," he replied. "I'm just here to help where I can." The young man nodded, his confidence visibly bolstered. As he walked away, Ethan turned to Samantha, who'd been watching the exchange. "That never gets old," he said, his tone lighter than usual. "It shouldn't," Samantha replied. "Because it matters." Months turned into a year, and the changes Ethan had made began to take root not just in his professional life but in his personal one as well. He reconnected with old friends, mended strained relationships, and began to find joy in the simple moments he had once overlooked. Samantha remained a constant presence in his life, their partnership evolving into a friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They continued to push each other, challenging their ideas of what success and legacy truly meant. One evening, after another long day of work, Ethan found himself back at the Silver Ridge Bistro. This time, he wasn't there to reclaim control or seek answers. He was simply there to reflect. Samantha spotted him from across the room, her expression softening as she approached his table. "Back again?" she asked, her tone teasing. Ethan smiled, setting his menu aside. "Some habits are hard to break." Samantha chuckled, pulling out her notepad. Well, in that case, what'll it be? Surprise me, he said, echoing the words he'd spoken during their very first encounter. But this time, his tone carried none of the arrogance it once had. Samantha nodded, scribbling down his order before glancing at him. You've changed, Ethan. It suits you. He smiled, the sincerity in her words warming something deep within him. I had a good teacher. As she walked away, Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the restaurant wash over him. He wasn't the man he used to be, and for the first time, he felt at peace with that. His life, once defined by power and control, was now guided by something far greater, a desire to leave the world better than he'd found it. And for Ethan Cross, that was the greatest success of all. In the months following his quiet dinner at the Silver Ridge Bistro, Ethan found himself reflecting more deeply on the moments that had shaped his transformation. The memory of Samantha's calm defiance and the way she had guided him without judgment became a cornerstone of his growth. He began journaling, a habit he hadn't practiced since his early 20s, trying to put into words the emotions and realizations he'd experienced. One night, as he sat at his desk in his now less imposing office, he wrote, "For years, I thought power meant control. I believed wealth was the ultimate measure of success. But now I see that power is the ability to lift others, and success is measured in the lives we touch. Samantha taught me that, not with lectures or demands, but by living her truth. I want to honor that truth, not just for her, but for myself." He paused, staring at the words before closing the notebook and leaning back in his chair. For the first time in years, he felt like he was building something meaningful, not just in the world, but within himself. At HopeWorks, Samantha was noticing the changes too. Ethan's involvement had gone beyond financial support. He was present at workshops, mentoring young minds, and sharing his own missteps and lessons in a way that felt authentic. The participants respected him, not for his wealth, but for his willingness to learn alongside them. One afternoon, as they wrapped up a workshop on entrepreneurship, Samantha found Ethan sitting with a group of participants, laughing as one of them recounted a story about his first failed pitch. It was a sight she never thought she'd see, a man who once radiated arrogance now sitting shoulder to shoulder with those he once dismissed. When the group dispersed, Samantha approached, leaning against the edge of the table. "You're getting the hang of this," she said, her voice warm. Ethan smiled up at her. "It's easier when you stop pretending you have all the answers." "Hard lesson to learn, isn't it?" she teased. "The hardest," he admitted. "But worth it." Samantha nodded, her gaze softening. "You know, when I first met you, I never would have imagined this. You've come a long way." Ethan tilted his head, a faint smirk on his lips. "From a self-absorbed businessman to a slightly less self-absorbed businessman?" She laughed, shaking her head. "From someone who saw people as obstacles to someone who sees them as partners. That's no small thing." Her words carried weight, and Ethan felt a flicker of pride, not the kind that came from accolades or achievements, but the kind that came from knowing he had earned her respect. Months later, HopeWorks reached a milestone, its largest fundraising campaign yet. The event, held in a sprawling outdoor venue, was attended by hundreds of supporters, from local artists to corporate leaders. Ethan stood near the back of the crowd, watching as Samantha addressed the audience with her usual grace and authenticity. "For 10 years, HopeWorks has been about more than just resources or programs," she said. "It's been about belief. Belief in the power of creativity, in the resilience of the human spirit, and in the idea that everyone deserves a chance to shine. Tonight, we celebrate not just what we've accomplished, but what's still to come." The crowd erupted into applause, and Ethan found himself clapping harder than he expected. As Samantha stepped off the stage, she made her way toward him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "Great speech," he said as she reached him. "Thanks," she replied, her smile tired but genuine. "I meant every word." "I know you did," he said, his voice softer now. "And so does everyone here. That's why they believe in you." Samantha's smile widened, and for a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the energy of the event buzzing around them. "You know," she said finally, "when you first walked into the bistro, I never thought I'd see you here." Ethan chuckled. "Neither did I. But I'm glad you are," she added. "You've made a difference, Ethan. Not just here, but for yourself." Her words struck a chord, and Ethan felt a swell of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. "Thank you," he said simply. Samantha nodded, and as the night wore on, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. a feeling he realized was far more valuable than anything he had ever chased before. Years later, Ethan stood outside a newly constructed building, a gleaming addition to the HopeWorks campus. The sign above the entrance read, Cross Center for Creativity. The dedication ceremony was modest, as Samantha had insisted, but the meaning behind it was profound. As he cut the ribbon alongside Samantha, the small crowd of attendees cheered. Ethan felt a surge of emotion, knowing this wasn't just a building, it was a legacy. A true legacy, built not on wealth but on impact. Samantha leaned over, her voice quiet. "You've come a long way, Ethan." "So have we," he replied, his tone filled with gratitude. And as they stepped through the doors, Ethan knew he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. A life of purpose, built on connection, compassion, and the belief that everyone, no matter their station, had something to offer the world. Months after the opening of the Cross Center for Creativity, Ethan found himself immersed in the day-to-day operations of the programs he helped establish. His mornings, once dominated by aggressive board meetings, now began with quiet visits to the center. It had become a sanctuary, a reminder of how far he had come and the lives he was helping to change. On a sunny morning, he sat in a small conference room with a group of young entrepreneurs, listening as they pitched their ideas for startups and projects. One by one, they spoke about their ambitions, some rooted in technology, others in community development. Ethan found himself more engaged than he'd ever been in any corporate meeting. Here, the stakes felt real, personal. When the last presenter finished, Ethan leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "These ideas are inspiring," he said, his tone genuine. "But let me ask you this. What's the bigger picture? What do you want your work to stand for?" The question caught a few of them off guard, but a young woman named Layla spoke up. "I want my business to create opportunities," she said. "I grew up in a place where opportunities felt like a luxury. I want to change that." Ethan nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Then you're already on the right track. Don't lose sight of that." After the session ended, Layla approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Cross," she began, her voice steady but nervous, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Ethan replied, gesturing for her to sit down. "How did you know it was time to change? To do something different?" Ethan paused, her question hitting close to home. He thought back to the moment he met Samantha, the quiet strength in her defiance, the way she had shattered his carefully constructed world with nothing more than her authenticity. "I didn't know at first," he admitted. "I was too wrapped up in my own version of success to see what I was missing. But someone showed me a different way, showed me what it meant to make a real impact. And once I saw that, I couldn't go back." Layla nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "It's not easy, is it? Changing?" "No," Ethan said, his tone firm but encouraging. "But the best things in life rarely are." Meanwhile, Samantha continued to lead HopeWorks with the same passion and determination that had defined her journey. The foundation had expanded significantly since its early days, but she remained as hands-on as ever, attending workshops, mentoring participants, and ensuring that no one felt overlooked. One evening, as she reviewed grant applications in her office, Ethan knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside. "Burning the midnight oil," he teased, a cup of coffee in each hand. Samantha smiled, motioning for him to sit. "It's the job," she said, accepting one of the cups. "But I wouldn't trade it for anything." Ethan settled into the chair across from her, his gaze drifting to the stack of papers on her desk. "You've built something incredible, Samantha." She chuckled softly. "We've built something incredible." He shook his head. "You started this long before I came along. I just had the good sense to follow your lead." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Samantha spoke again. "You've changed a lot, Ethan. Do you ever think about who you were before all this?" "Every day," he admitted. "Not in a regretful way, but as a reminder of how far I've come, how far I still have to go." Samantha studied him, her expression thoughtful. "That's the thing about growth," she said. "It's a journey, not a destination." Ethan nodded, her words resonating deeply. He had spent so much of his life chasing goals, believing that happiness lay in the next achievement. But now he understood that true fulfillment came from the process, the connections, and the impact he could make. In the years that followed, the Cross Center became a beacon of hope and opportunity in the city. Ethan's transformation became a story that inspired others, proof that change was possible, even for those who seemed the least likely to embrace it. At a ceremony marking the 5th anniversary of the center, Samantha and Ethan stood side by side on the stage, addressing a crowd of supporters, participants, and community leaders. HopeWorks has always been about belief, Samantha said, her voice steady and warm. Belief in creativity, in resilience, and in the power of people to rise above their circumstances. But it's also about something more: partnership. None of this would be possible without the people who choose to invest their time, their resources, and their hearts into making a difference. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Samantha taught me that success isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. And tonight, I want to challenge all of you to think about the legacy you want to leave behind. Not just in terms of wealth or accomplishments, but in the lives you touch and the change you inspire. The audience erupted into applause, and as the sound washed over them, Ethan turned to Samantha, his expression full of gratitude. She smiled back, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. For Ethan, this was his legacy, not the buildings, the programs, or the accolades, but the lives that had been transformed because he chose to change. And for Samantha, it was a reminder that even the most unexpected allies could become the greatest champions of a cause. As the ceremony wound down and guests began to mingle, Ethan found himself standing by one of the large windows of the Cross Center's main hall. The city stretched out before him, the skyline illuminated by countless lights. It was a familiar view, but one that felt profoundly different now. This wasn't about dominance or control anymore. It was about connection and purpose. Samantha joined him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to him with a quiet smile. "You seem lost in thought," she said. Ethan took the glass, chuckling softly. "Just reflecting. A lot has changed. For the better," she said, her tone warm but firm. "You've done more than most people ever would." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever stop and think about how far you've come? What you've built?" "All the time," she admitted. "But it's not just about looking back. It's about looking forward. What's next? How do we keep growing?" Ethan nodded, her words echoing his own thoughts. "What's next for you, Samantha?" She leaned against the window frame, her gaze distant. "I want to take HopeWorks further, expand into other cities, maybe even internationally. There are so many people out there who could use a chance, a little support to get started. And you'll do it," Ethan said with certainty. "If anyone can, it's you." Samantha smiled at him, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "What about you, Ethan? What's next for you?" He paused, considering her question. For so long, his answer would have been another deal, another acquisition, another climb up the ladder. But now the answer felt different. "I want to keep doing this," he said finally. "Building, supporting, giving back. It feels real in a way nothing else ever has." Samantha raised her glass. "To what's next, then?" Ethan clinked his glass against hers, a quiet toast to the journey ahead. Years later, Ethan stood in the same hall, this time at a smaller gathering. The Cross Center had grown beyond his wildest dreams, with branches in multiple cities and programs that reached thousands of people. HopeWorks had become a global initiative, recognized as a leader in community-driven support for creatives and entrepreneurs. As he looked around the room, he saw familiar faces. Participants who had once been nervous teenagers presenting their ideas now stood as confident professionals, mentors, and leaders in their own right. The ripple effect of Samantha's vision and his own transformation was undeniable. Samantha approached him, her hair streaked with gray, but her energy as vibrant as ever. "You're still staring out of windows," she teased, her smile widening. Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "Old habits die hard." She joined him, her gaze sweeping over the room. "It's incredible, isn't it? What this has become." "It is," he agreed. "And it all started with you." She shook her head gently. "It started with both of us. You chose to change, Ethan. That's no small thing." He turned to her, his expression earnest. "I couldn't have done it without you." Samantha smiled, but her words carried weight. "That's the thing about change. It's never done alone. We all need someone to believe in us, to push us to be better." Ethan nodded, her words resonating deeply. For all his success, he knew now that the greatest legacy he could leave was one built on connection, compassion, and the courage to grow. As the evening continued, Ethan found himself surrounded by people who had become not just colleagues or partners, but community. His journey, once defined by ambition and isolation, had become one of purpose and belonging. And for the first time, he knew that was the legacy he had always been searching for.